Hey, I just finished Revelation Space by Alastair Reynolds about 5 minutes ago, so I'm going to give you my fresh thoughts. I haven't read any other criticism or watched any other videos. These are my thoughts. Overall, it's good. It is good. Here's my nutshell review. Really competent space opera, which I love. I pretty much can't read space opera without liking it. It's my favorite subgenre of sci-fi. It does not stack up in quality to the best of the genre. It's nowhere near as good as something like Hyperion, or certainly not as good as the Zones of Thought books, at least the first two. I haven't read the third one. Which is, not necessarily a criticism, because how can you really compete with Fire Upon the Deep? I consider it not only the best space opera, but the best sci-fi book, and I had that in my mind as a benchmark that I was comparing this work to, which might not be a fair fight, but overall, I thought it was a fairly competent book that had a lot of problems with it. The problems were not prohibitive to reading the book. It was really quickly, without giving anything away, too long. The characters were not quite strong enough. The dialogue was quite poor, and the pacing was off. But there were a number of story arcs that paid off gratifyingly in the same volume, which is to its credit. I hate it when there are these dangling story arcs that aren't resolved until book 2 or 3 or 4 or 8 of a series. Hyperion did that, which I just found infuriating. So it is its own self-contained novel, which I appreciate, and it did say some interesting things. I would give it a 7 out of 10. It was a frustrating read in parts. There was this long middle period of the book around the 75% mark, right up until the very ending, where I just ceased to give a shit about the characters. It became too convoluted and too slow and way too much dialogue happening, and it was a slog to get to the end of the book. But I'm glad that I did, because the ending is awesome. The ending was masterfully executed and actually made me want to read the second book, which I didn't think that I would want to. Let's talk about the specific critiques and the plot a little bit more. It was a book written by a scientist. I think he was an astronomer or astrophysicist. There are long passages of hard sci-fi where he's talking about the science, like the quantum physics underlying a lot of what's going on with alien technology and artificial intelligence and these big cosmic events and celestial bodies that are behaving in strange ways. There are parts of the book like that that are perfectly written and like really, really good hard sci-fi that doesn't feel overly technical, and it's written in parts that are genuinely quite beautiful, which is a hard feat to pull off. So I really commend him for that. And that's the strength. One of the big buttressing strengths of the book is that it's written from a place of outlandishness, but also plausibility, which is a mixture that you really want from sci-fi, especially hard sci-fi. I have another note, which is a little bit self-contradictory, which is it was a little bit too far of a reach in terms of the science fiction elements of the story, in terms of how technology worked. And it was not quite unique enough to be genuinely interesting for the most part, and a lot of the fine details of the world building. So what I mean by that is that the technology is so advanced and we're so far in the future that there is kind of a law of diminishing returns with these kinds of stories, where the technology becomes so sophisticated and so fluid and operating on such a vague set of parameters and rules that it might as well be magic. Structurally, this is more of a fantasy story, or as much of a fantasy story as it is a science fiction story, just in terms of the narrative mechanics of how the characters operate in the world. The technology is able to resolve almost every problem seamlessly, without a whole lot of difficulty, and it's not clear where technological sophistication begins and ends in conflict with with certain problems in the story, which kind of flattens the stakes a little bit. It also just isn't, it doesn't make for very interesting storytelling, because it's like, I don't know, it's like walking through Best Buy or something and seeing all of these big HD TVs, and they're all 87 inches across. I don't even know if that's big these days. But you're just kind of engulfed in this cave of technology, and it kind of becomes undifferentiated in front of your eyes. It loses a little bit of its sense of marvel. And I got that from this book. Also, it is good universe building. It's a solid, internally logically consistent universe that he constructed. But it doesn't deviate all of that far off of kind of standard sci-fi tropes. There are interesting treatments of those tropes that are unique to the story, or at least done very, very well. But it does draw on the same basic palette of just certain, like, not cliches, but just like all familiar moving parts in a science fiction story. And maybe it's not fair to level this as a criticism of, wow, you didn't reinvent the science fiction novel entirely. But that's what I like in space opera, and I'm spoiled by Vinge, because when you read Fire Upon the Deep, it is like entering a truly alien universe. It is both familiar and completely new and remade, with this totally bizarre, unique gloss of paint on it. And I just had this sense of awe reading Fire Upon the Deep that was missing here. It was just a little bit too familiar. It was a little bit too Star Trek. The characters didn't really carry me that well through the story. They weren't that well drawn, they weren't that complicated, and the quality of the dialogue was poor. That's the only real hard criticism that I have of this book, is that the dialogue sucked. It truly did, and I wish that it didn't. And this is kind of, unfortunately, going with the territory with sci-fi a lot of the time. But it was not only poor dialogue, it was copious dialogue, so people spoke for completely unrealistic spans of time, and these big soliloquies, these big Shakespearean expository speeches. And also, everybody spoke with this tone of like epic snark that I hated. I just hated it, and it pulled me out of the story. It was like, the second I recognized this and this clicked, it kind of ruined all of the dialogue for me, but it sounds like anime characters talking. If you hear it in this overwrought, overacted anime villain voice, it just meshes seamlessly of people explaining all of their motivations to each other and thinking out loud, almost like it was in a comic book. I just thought it was quite poorly done, and detracted from the story. And that's, I guess, another criticism, and I will lavish this book with some more praise, I promise, because I did like the book. But also, there was way too much info dumping happening, and this is another native peril of these big idea sci-fi epics, which is, how do you construct a sophisticated and narratively elaborate universe with its own set of rules and physics without info dumping? How do you demonstrate that through events in the story or actions that the characters take, or limited, artfully done exposition? I imagine that's one of the greatest challenges of doing science fiction writing, and unfortunately it's not executed that well in this book. It is just straight, again, big, long chunks of exposition that is overly detailed, and a lot of it isn't really that interesting. So there's a core of really interesting plot dynamics at play, and big ideas that are genuinely big and are interesting. They're not groundbreaking, but they are interesting, and they're peppered in through the whole book. But it's a very long book. I read it on Kindle, so I don't have it as a big prop, but it's like Moby Dick sized. It's really thick. So there's enough of a crumb trail to entice you through the story for the most part, although, like I said, around the 3/4 mark, that just dries up, and it becomes this long kind of court intrigue drama among space pirates on the ship, one of the main settings of the book, and it just loses bandwidth. I just didn't give a shit after a certain point. But the big ideas do pay off in the end, which was a really good ending, a really interesting ending, and it does give you that dopamine hit of, wow, the universe just jumped up in size and complexity, and it became even more fascinating than it was. So I don't regret reading it. I am tempted to read the second one, although I have such a huge stack of other books that I want to read, I might not get directly around to it. I think that it's a solid entry in the space genre, space opera genre, but I would not put it on par with the classics, and I think it does suffer a little bit from some issues with the quality of the prose, the quality of the structuring and the plotting, but it does a whole lot of things really right, and it does enough right things to make it worth the time to read it. 7 out of 10. Would recommend if you have a taste for space opera and you like hard sci-fi. It's a good marriage of those two things that definitely it pulls it off. So appreciate you watching this, and happy reading, I guess.